All right, well, I think we'll get started. Thank you guys so much for coming. We're excited you're all joining us tonight. My name is Katie Schofield. I'm the Adult Services Assistant here at McFarland Public Library. We are at the Facts About Foreign Policy, a community discussion with UW Madison professors. We are so honored and excited to have this panel with us here tonight to share their knowledge with us. We have Dr. Andrew Kydd, Dr. Yoshiko Herrera, Dr. Jon Pevehouse, and Dr. Scott Mobley. The news has been moving at a rapid pace, so we're very grateful to have these experts here to share some context behind what's happening in the headlines. We ask that you listen respectfully to them and to each other as we learn together. And I'm going to now pass it off to Dr. Herrera to talk a little bit about the format of the evening.
Thank you. So thank you all for coming. This is actually the third of our in our series of reaching out to the community, having faculty from the political science department go to different libraries around the Madison area. And our idea is to present some information based on our research related to foreign policy, and we're going to weave in between U.S. Policy and some case studies of other countries, and then back to the U.S. I won't say a lot other than the order will be as the people appear here. We're all professors in the department, and you can see our research interests. And we're going to try to keep it to 10 minutes or so each, so that we have time for questions. So thank you for joining us. Okay, so we're going to start with Andrew Kydd.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting us. It's a big honor. So I'm just going to give you a couple of big picture thoughts on American foreign policy and a little bit about what makes Trump distinct, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Gaza war before handing it off to my colleagues. So some of the big picture things we think about when we're trying to analyze foreign policy or think about it is, what are American interests? Sometimes this is phrased as, what is the national interest? What is good for America? And we think of a couple of things under this heading. Number one, security. Security is usually thought of as safety, sort of lowering the likelihood that you're going to be attacked. And the Defense Department is all about that, now renamed the Department of War, of course. And it's sometimes linked to territory, being able to defend your territory. Some states want to acquire more territory, and that's related to security as well. Prosperity is, of course, very important. Another key interest for countries around the world. Prosperity, wealth accumulation, increasing the welfare of their citizens. Then, if you have more broad interests, you might be concerned about the security and prosperity of your friends and allies. The United States traditionally has had sort of more expansive interests along those ways. And you might also have other values that are unrelated to security or prosperity, like democracy, freedom, human rights. If you have a religion, that's your state religion, something like that. These are all interests that states try to advance or achieve. Another broad axis of debate is, how should the United States behave internationally? Should we be engaged, or should we be more restrained? Should we be out in the world doing things, being involved, negotiating, having military forces deployed here and there, or should we be coming home? Should we be staying mostly at home, letting the world take care of itself, not rushing to put out every fire around the world? And this can be broken down into geographical thoughts. So how should we behave in Europe, East Asia, the Middle East, the rest of the world, et cetera. And then another axis of debate is, how should we think about using force? Should we use force sparingly, as a last resort, rarely, more frequently? Should we do it with allies? Should we do it with a UN blessing? Or should we do it unilaterally on our own? And if you think about these issues with respect to different views of American foreign policy, you'll get some interesting contrasts, I think. And so I've got a couple of issues. I won't go through the whole table, there's a lot of cells, but just contrasting the usual Democratic view, Democratic Party, traditional Republican Party view versus Trump, I think is instructive in some ways. So national interests, Democrats and Republicans traditionally agreed in a fairly expansive definition of American interests. We have interests around the world. We have allies around the world. We're defending the free world. We have troops in Europe. We have troops in Japan. And so we're sort of engaged and out there, big conception of our interests. Trump has advocated a more narrow conception of American national interests, focusing primarily on prosperity for the United States. Much less concern about international allies, although not no concern, as we'll see. Values, Democrats and Republicans have both agreed that democracy promotion is good. There's some debate about human rights, freedom. Trump has pursued a more, you might call it right-wing populism sort of values, being friends with leaders like Bolsonaro in Brazil and others around the world that he considers to be sharing his political orientation. Engagement, again, Democrats and Republicans traditionally in favor of international engagement, an American role in the world, Trump largely against it in rhetoric, although we'll see again in practice that he does actually want to be engaged in some ways. Allies, Democrats view them as friends, Republicans traditionally tend to view them as sort of friends, but not quite at our level. Trump has a sort of unique view of allies as free riders, as people who are basically taking advantage of us. We are paying for their security and we're being taken advantage of. Use of force is another interesting one. Again, Democrats typically view it to be used rarely, if at all, with allies. Republicans traditionally more frequent and unilateral. Trump more of a restrainer here, interested in infrequent use, although of course he makes plenty of exceptions to that, as we saw with the Iran strike as well. Maybe the most extreme contrast is territorial ambitions. Traditionally, Democrats and Republicans, at least since World War II, have had no territorial ambitions. And Trump has spoken about wanting Greenland, wanting Canada, wanting to take back the Panama Canal. That hasn't been in the news recently, but it's there. Okay, one big structural thing I just wanted to put up here before talking about Gaza, defense spending. So the United States is still, by and large, the largest defense spender in the world. Here's global spending as a percent of total, United States at 37%. So we are king of the hill in terms of defense spending. China is number 2, Russia is number 3. And then come some of our European allies and some other countries like India, Saudi Arabia, et cetera. So that is a big structural factor. That is why we have influence around the world. That's why we have 12 aircraft carrier battle groups around the world able to exert influence and make our voice known. Here's military spending as a percentage of GDP. You can see an interesting case here that Professor Herrera will talk to. Ukraine tops the list. Ukraine has the highest military spending per capita GDP because they are fighting a war of national survival. Okay, I do want to keep it short so that we can get to the other players. I'll just talk about one issue that's currently in the news, Israel and Gaza. So just to recap, Hamas, based in Gaza, attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, killed around 1,200 people, took 250 hostages. And in response, Israel has been waging a war since then against Hamas in Gaza. Their stated goal being the destruction of Hamas as an organization. They've killed upwards of 66,000 people by this point and have assassinated the top leadership echelon of Hamas, in some cases multiple times over. If you were following the news today, you might have seen that there was a new Trump-Netanyahu peace plan that was just announced. And it's an interesting read. You can find it on many news sites. It differs from the previous Trump plan. The previous Trump plan was people in Gaza are going to be deported and we're going to redevelop it as a sort of Riviera of the Middle East. This is a bit more realistic, although perhaps still not fully realistic in some ways. People in Gaza are going to be allowed to stay, but Gaza will be taken over by an international entity, the top leader of which would be Donald J. Trump, and possibly the next leader, more local leader, would be Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, who has been very much interested in Middle East peace negotiations ever since he left office. Hamas would be disarmed, hostages would be released. Hamas was not consulted in the negotiation of this. This was Netanyahu and Trump. And Netanyahu has agreed to it. And one of the first clauses of the agreement says 72 hours after Israel agrees to it, the Hamas has to turn over the hostages. Else, the war continues. Again, this I think is what's interesting in its own right. It's a very serious issue, but in terms of how it reflects on overall American foreign policy, I think it reveals a couple of themes. Number one is, for all Trump's talk of restraint and not being interested in being in the world, he very much wants to be in the world. He wants to be the peacemaker, the negotiator here. He wants to be telling people what to do and bring about settlements to these wars. So he's very much engaged in the conflict. He's not talking about putting up any American troops, which is understandable. It's not clear where the troops are going to come from to implement this plan, should it go anywhere in 72 hours. But it is a sort of interesting reflection of Trump's view of the world, right? Trump will be in charge of the organization. There'll be lots of investment opportunities. And so again, the sort of background of Trump comes to fore in terms of his history as a real estate developer and whatnot. All right, I will leave it there. I'm happy to talk about other conflicts around the world that we don't touch upon if you like. The Iran nuclear issue is an important one. The war in Yemen is another one. But in the interest of time, I'll turn it over.
I'm going to speak about the Russian war in Ukraine and a little bit of update of how things have changed and where things are headed. So as most people know, Russia invaded Ukraine in a full-scale invasion in February 24th, 2022. It wanted to take over the whole country, wasn't able to do so. This map on the left here is the assessed areas of control by the Institute for the Study of War, U.S. think tank. Usually I usually put up 2 slides in these presentations, but in the interest of space, I didn't do that. One is to show what it looked like in March 2022, 1 month into it, and what it looks like now, and it basically looks the same. So those areas in blue were the initial incursion that Russia made, and then the Ukrainians pushed them back in the fall of 2022, and it's very similar from around October 2022 to now. Very little difference other than up in the Kursk, Sumy area. So even though it's been a massively destructive war, over 1 million casualties that's dead, missing, wounded, taken prisoner on the Russian side, with 200 to 300 estimated dead in Russia, and on the Ukrainian side, 380,000 casualties with estimates of 46,000 dead. It's been massively destructive, but the front lines haven't really changed that much in the last 3 years, which just shows you, in a certain way, you could say the futility of it. It doesn't mean that it's quiet at the front. It's very deadly, but there hasn't been a lot of gain different ways. Also, within the country of Ukraine, more than 3.7 million internally displaced people, and another a couple of million have left the country altogether. So there's just been a lot of destruction in Ukraine. This picture is just from Sunday, a huge attack on Kydd, and that's the destruction of it. What has changed or not changed? This is a recent innovation from the Institute of Study of War. They show the number of drone and missile strikes on Ukraine every day, starting from January 2025. And something that's interesting is that, as Andy said, President Trump could have said, I don't care about this war. J.D. Vance, as a candidate, Vice President Vance said, Ukraine is not in our national interest, just like irrelevant. Could have said, countries fight, whatever, we have our things here. A typical isolationist position would have been to say, just don't care what's happening there. But actually, President Trump made it a campaign issue to say he would end the war in 3 days. And he's actually expended a lot of social capital, political capital, to try to end the war. I think something that's interesting is when he really ramped that up, in the spring, that was followed by a huge increase on the Russian side in drone and missile strikes on Ukraine. So things didn't work out very well in April, and then Russia just unleashed. For a while, every day was a new record. If you look from May up until July, they were just like increasing every day, including, they note in July here, the Trump and Putin phone call. And Putin's reaction to Trump's overtures to try to end the war has been to just massively bombard Ukraine even further. And when I say bombard, they're sending missiles and drones into apartment buildings, schools, senior citizens waiting in line for pensions. The Russians will say, oh, we're only bombing military targets, but it's very clear that they're well beyond that. Okay, so the war has carried on. It's been very costly for both sides, but Ukraine has not budged in terms of its commitment to maintaining its independence as a state, maintaining Ukrainianness as a national identity. And I think it's fair to say Russia has not pulled back on any of its maximalist goals. And I think this is one of the frustrations of the Trump administration, is that they try to explain to them, like, hey, you know, we could be building hotels in Moscow, we could have investment, we could have deals, we could have rare earths, we could have all this stuff. And like, why don't you just stop this war? And the Russian side has been to just totally ignore that and carry on with the war. So what's happened this summer is that President Trump finally turned on Putin. Now, some people think that doesn't matter, rhetoric changes, etc. But I would say, as a Trump-Russia watcher over the years, President Trump's support for Putin has been solid since he was a candidate. He rarely criticized Putin until this summer. And he talked about having a friendship with him, he wished him well, all kinds of things like that. But this quote from the New York Times, where Trump is basically saying, like, he talks to him and he has these nice conversations, but then it turns out to be meaningless. Just yesterday, Vice President J.D. Vance was on Fox Sunday, and he's also changed his tune in terms of saying, quote, the Russians have got to wake up and accept reality here. A lot of people are dying, they don't have a lot to show for it. That's quite a bit different from the horrible February meeting in the Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky, where Trump repeatedly said, you don't have any cards, you don't have any cards. Vance was extremely aggressive towards President Zelensky. It was really a kind of nightmare for Ukraine watchers, but much has changed since that meeting, and one of the key things is that President Trump and his administration seem to realize that Russia is not actually interested in peace. And that's really been the stumbling block all along, is that Russia does not want to end the war. So just to kind of conclude, what does Russia want? Well, we'll stop Russia. This is the former president, former prime minister of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, speaking last year at a geography conference for kids, a geography bee for kids. And, you know, one of the questions for the kids is like, where are the borders of Russia? You know, and the answer from President Putin is Russia's borders do not end anywhere. And not to mention the denial of Ukraine being a country, saying Ukraine is, of course, Russia. And this map behind him is actually their mock-up of what Ukraine should look like. Interestingly, Moldova stays as a country. There were just elections in Moldova Sunday, actually, where the Russian-backed candidates lost. Very important election there. But in this Russian view of the world, Poland gets some part of Ukraine, Romania gets some part of Ukraine. Amazingly, they allow Kydd to remain as a sort of rump state there in the middle. But this is a kind of indicative stance of Russia, of saying we get to draw the borders, we decide who gets what. It's back to Yalta, back to us being the ones who are in charge in this region. So what will it take to stop Russia? Many people think military defeat, that Russia will not stop until it is stopped. But as you can see from 3 years into this, it's very costly. The current level of supply of weapons to Ukraine is not really enough to decisively win the war. That could change if there is a bigger push from Europe or even from the US. Another thing Vice President J.D. Vance mentioned today or yesterday was the potential for Tomahawk missiles to go to Ukraine, which would be long-range missiles that could strike Moscow, et cetera. So military defeat, that's one option. The land for peace, I think many people have realized this is not going to work. Initially, the Trump administration floated the idea of just saying, okay, how about if Russia just keeps the land it controls, around 20% of Ukraine? And the Russians basically said, like, no, like that's not good enough for us. And Ukraine, of course, is not going to that interested in giving up the land. But I think most people understand that Russia is not actually interested in just land. They're interested in controlling Ukraine as a country. A ceasefire, that was also talked about a lot in the spring. And most people think that the ceasefire and the talk of ceasefire would just be used by Russia to rebuild its forces and strike again. So it's not likely to lead to a lasting peace. This frozen conflict idea actually is relevant because in Moldova, there are Russian troops in the Transnistria region. That's a so-called frozen conflict where there was a conflict. It sort of ended in terms of the fighting, but the Russian troops stayed in place. Russian troops similarly still in place in Abkhazia and in Northern Ossetia, one of the breakaway Georgian regions that Russia also claims. So a frozen conflict where you just keep Russian troops in place, many people also think is not very stable. The external military support for Ukraine, I would say in 2025, this has been a real roller coaster. There was a time when it looked like it was in the realm of possibility that the US could pull out of NATO, that the US could stop weapon supply to Ukraine altogether. We did briefly pause intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Ukraine relies on Starlink, Elon Musk company, supported by the Department of Defense. So things were very up in the air, but now it looks like the US is back to the idea that Europe and NATO can buy weapons from America and then use them in Ukraine. Ukraine seems to have a green light on striking, at least with drones, parts of Russia. And just recently, something I think that was really important at the UN meeting is that President Trump was asked what should happen if a Russian manned or crewed aircraft violates NATO airspace, and he said they should shoot it down. That's important because that's different from shooting down a drone or uncrewed aircraft, and it's also would have been a huge problem for NATO if President Trump had said, no, Russia can violate NATO airspace and we won't actually do anything about it. So so I think the external military support is now something that's really in flux. I just want to note on the sanctions that lots of people are hoping the Russian economy will collapse, and they have been hoping that for 3.5 years. And despite many things like gasoline shortages that are currently happening now, it just keeps going. So I think it's a little bit of hopeful or wishful thinking on the pro-Ukrainian side to think that the current situation is going to weaken Russia's economy enough to make them reconsider. I think what's clear is that Putin doesn't care about the economic destruction of the country. He's just going to keep going. But the Trump administration has floated the idea of much stricter sanctions, full financial sanctions, et cetera. And so I think that's a possibility for the future. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Pevehouse.
I know, right, yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm going to shift gears and move away from national security and conflict in Europe and in the Middle East and talk about another big headline-grabbing phenomenon since Trump has come into office, which are tariffs. And this shows historically, where, you've heard of different, sorry, I need to walk around. I can't stay still. This is kind of the tariffs at the foundation of the Republic. This is actually called the Tariff of Abominations, which then come back up to pay for the Civil War. Then, you get another post-war set of tariffs to try to pay debt from the Civil War. And then Smoot-Hawley is there. Smoot-Hawley does, Smoot-Hawley is so bad, and it was, but, in historical standards. And the green line would be as of the spring if all of the Trump threatened tariffs took effect, right? So you'd be at this sort of historic high level. And then, of course, after World War II, right, interwar period, we get the Great Depression and Trump and tariffs go up. After that, they've come down under various global trade rules like the WTO, and this new, that line represents where they would be. These days, given how many there are threats and then they come off and they go back on, this is sort of a range to think about, is probably more helpful. This is a particular study done at a budget lab, the budget lab at Yale, sort of saying like, you know, the top line would be if all of them went in, the bottom line would be if the minimum went in, and sort of everything in between. You know, these have been fairly off and on again. This lists our top trading partners and where they are as of August 7th, which has been the latest big round of change. There have been more threats. There were more threats this weekend on movies. There were threats today about furniture, right? Every day it's a little bit something new. But the bottom line is there's a lot of flux going on with our tariff rates. The general history of these rates for most of these countries prior to Trump coming in was somewhere between 2% and 4%, right? To give you a sense of the scale of sort of what's been added. Obviously, some countries are experiencing higher, some are lower. Some of this is a reflection of Trump's priorities, economic priorities, sometimes their political priorities. For example, with India, to tie this to Yohi's comments, right? Trump is mad that India is buying a lot of oil from Russia. So he's threatening he's put high tariffs on India until they stop buying oil from Russia. There's also some technology issues he has with India that he wants solved, so he puts those on. Others he's made some deal with. The European Union, he made a kind of a temporary deal with. China, he actually made a temporary deal with. Remember, that China number was over 100% at one point in the summer, and he's kind of brought it back down. So, and I want us to remember the first time, called version 1 of Trump tariffs, there were some very specific things going on with those tariffs back in 2018. First of all, notice the dates. Trump was elected in 2016. We don't get tariffs till 2018. So for 2 years, he talked about tariffs. We're going to do tariffs. We're going to do tariffs. He didn't actually do them until 2018. And so what happened? Well, this long lead up allowed firms, companies that did international trade, to stock their warehouses. And there's been several studies by economists showing that you got this massive, huge increase in imports into the United States in 2016 and 2017, which then smoothed over when these tariffs kicked in 2018 because the warehouses were full. You didn't pay tariffs on those goods in the warehouse, they were already here, right? And so firms adapted and looked ahead and saw that. The tariffs are also incomplete. For example, all consumer goods were excluded from these tariffs to lessen the impact on you and I going to Target or Walmart or wherever, right? If there was a consumer good, they weren't tariffed. iPhones weren't tariffed, right? Automobiles weren't tariffed, right? There were threats on all those, but it was a very narrow set of tariffs, mostly on goods from China. He used these ultimately as bargaining chips. We renegotiated NAFTA into something called the US, Mexico, Canada trade deal. He made this trade deal with China in like late 2018, early 2019. He made deals with Brazil, Argentina, and South Korea on steel. So lots of threats, lots of blustering. Ultimately, many of them get negotiated away. Now, I'll talk about the current tariffs a little bit, but the way I want to talk about this for the next few minutes is really try to figure out what problem these tariffs are trying to solve. And, you know, I know we're supposed to be politically neutral, but I have a lot of strong feelings on tariffs. So here we go. All right, so you can go to any website. Go to a website, go to Google and say, I want to move my factory to Mexico, and see what pops up. You'll get 20 hits on Google from firms that will help you move your factory to Mexico. And these are the types of data they will show you. The difference between employing people in Mexico and the United States. Mexico wage hours are different. They're 48 hours a week, not 40. The direct labor costs, $5.30 versus $23. Right? You cannot pay someone's health insurance as an employer for $5.30 an hour. Right? It won't work. This gives you the savings. I have 50 employees. Here's what I'd pay in Mexico. Here's what I'd pay in the US. There's my savings. If I have 200 employees, I save almost $7 million a year by moving my factory to Mexico. No 50% tariff is going to offset this. It will not happen. It cannot happen. Right? The wage costs are that different. Right? And tariffs will not fix that. Okay? So, restore jobs? Maybe. But here's the problem. We have this image of the United States as this industrial society making products, making goods, And there's some truth to that after World War II, for sure. But you see, here's where people have worked in the US since the middle of the 19th century. This is industry. Yes, post-World War I, post-World War II. But why is that high? It's high because everyone else's factories were destroyed in the war. We made everything in the United States because no one else had anything left to do. But even then, most people in the United States worked in services. They were teachers, they were nurses, they were doctors, right? They were these high education positions. Agriculture, of course, when we started out, goes to next to nothing. This is a normal development for all countries, and the United States is no different. But again, we have this historical view of the United States of this, right? Everyone working in the union, on the line, for good paying jobs. You know what a car factory looks like today? Robots. That's not a tariff or a China problem, that's a robot problem. There's one person in this picture. Up there, there's one person, besides the person taking the picture. There's one guy watching the line, right? This is a robot problem to some extent, not completely. But the reason manufacturing jobs have dried up is a combination of some of these factories have moved, but a lot of them, even the ones who have moved, have gone to mechanics, robots, right? It's a very different type of structural labor force that you need these days. Happy to talk more about that. Trump's other big line is, well, we'll generate income. These tariffs will make $2 billion a day and we can get rid of the income tax. And in fact, right, why were tariffs so high back here? Because there was no federal income tax. The federal income tax doesn't come online until the 1910s. And so if you wanted to build roads or run the postal service, you needed tariffs. This is how the federal government makes money, right? Until the 1910s, and the Constitution gets amended, creating the federal income tax, right? Now, if you make $2 billion a day, you know how many days you need to make up, to basically get rid of the income tax? You need 1,100 days of the year to make up for the federal income tax. Again, the math doesn't work. And that's assuming you make $2 billion a day for all eternity. What happens when prices on goods go up for tariffs? Do you buy more or do you buy less? You buy less, which means tariff income goes what? Down. Right? Basic economics, supply and demand, right? Maybe you're trying to confront China, and this is a real thing, right? In 2000, here was every state's most favored trading partner, and here it is in 2024. China has taken over the world in terms of trade. China is the leading exporter to almost every country in the world, right? And this bothers the Trump administration, it bothers many Republicans, it bothers many Democrats, right? That China seems to have their fingers in everything all over the world from a trade perspective. The issue is, if you're going to do this, I would argue, what you need to do is adopt a set of strategic tariffs to try to encourage folks to buy from the US, not from China. Instead, what this administration has done is tariff everyone. Every country has tariffs on it. And so now, not only are we, of course, tariffing China, potentially at 100% if they don't agree to things, we're tariffing all these countries, and China is now saying, we're not tariffing anymore. So now people, and you saw this report over the weekend, US soybean exports, right, have plummeted because now China isn't buying them from the US. In fact, China is now selling them to everywhere. Brazil's selling them. They're not charging, they're lowering prices, and it's undercutting, right, American exports, right? So again, there's a strategy by which you could use tariffs to confront China, but putting them on everyone, even the states who still like us, the EU. Those are some of the highest tariffs he suggested. Now we reached a deal with the EU, so now they're back down. But if you're going to use this as a diplomatic tool, it could be something different. Something else that bothers the administration, it bothers Democrats, it bothers Republicans, bothers a lot of voters, this trade deficit, right? We import a lot more than we export, and that bothers people. It doesn't bother economists, just for the record. Go find me an economist who's bothered by a trade deficit. I can think of 3, and all of them are in the White House right now. Okay, why? An economist would say, you have something I want, a good, I have something you want, money, we make a deal. It's capitalism, free markets. Who cares? You may make a little more than I do. I may make a little more than you do sometimes. It's all going to come out in the end, right? The flip side is, what happens with that trade deficit? That means there's a lot of money. There's a lot of US dollars floating out in the world. And where do you think those US dollars end up? In our stock market. And that's what's helping to drive up markets. It's what's helping to drive up investment income. And so the opposite of a trade deficit, right, is the current account balance, or what's called the foreign investment surplus. Those are mirror images of one another. So if you get rid of the bottom one, you're going to get rid of the top one too. They can't, one goes up, one goes down, by definition. Right? So again, I'm not saying trade deficit isn't necessarily a problem, but just know solving it isn't free. Solving it isn't free. Trade deficits we talked about, a bargaining chip. I'll skip that, kind of move ahead. I think that there are other costs to tariffs, obviously higher consumer goods. You threaten supply chains. China's going to gain market, I think, because of these. You know, for decades, America has promoted free trade. We're not doing that anymore, right? There's a lot of norms about trade restrictions, for example, and you've seen the Supreme Court's going to make a decision on this. The law Trump has used to enact all of these tariffs is a national security provision in US trade law. US trade law says if you're in a war, you can tariff anything as much as you want. And Trump has said we're in a war. We're in a war against China. We're in a trade war against China. And therefore, legally, I can do all of this. An appellate court has said no, you cannot. Now the Supreme Court's going to decide, essentially, whether that's an okay justification. Who knows what will come out. The US has here's our trade deficit in goods, things, but we export a lot of services, banks, insurance, technology, right? A lot of money comes into this country for our technological goods. The concern is that eventually if these tariffs really do start to anger other countries, they'll start tariffing our services. They'll tariff some of our goods. They'll stop buying soybeans. They'll also do things like say, Google, you can't operate in our country anymore. Apple, you can't sell iPhones in our country anymore, right? You can't, and so all of those things, nationwide, you can't sell insurance in our country anymore, right? And so that's what's kind of hanging in the balance here. So it's a multi-sided picture. I'm gonna stop there so Scott has some time, but happy to talk about other international economic issues.
All right, I'm gonna take a step back here. I'm gonna give you some context and some on civil military relations, in particular, an issue that's has come to the forefront over the last few years, which is politicization. I practiced that word like all afternoon, politicization of the US military. And think about what's going on behind the scenes. We've heard about a lot of foreign policy, national security policy. That's all happening in DC and various commands around the world where there's interaction between the civilian leadership and the military. That's how it's supposed to work. Under the Constitution, that's one of the reasons they set up the Constitution, is to set up the framework for this type of interaction. So let me just dive into this. Let's see. All right, so if we look at the Constitution, look at the way civil military relations have set up over time, we have this idea, this idealized view of the military as a nonpartisan, politically astute institution. And in a perfect world, that's what we want to see. In the real world, if you look at history, it's kind of waxed and waned, but particularly since the late 19th century, when truly professional militaries came on the scene, including ours, it's pretty much been the norm. And in that relationship, you have what's called the unequal dialogue, where the military provides advice to the civilian leadership. It's supposed to be best advice, good advice, with the interests of national security and foreign policy in mind. And then the civilian leadership listens to that. There may be some conversation. In the end, the civilians make the decision. The military salutes and marches off to execute those decisions. So in order to do that, we have to have a military with professional ethos. It's outlined on this slide. It has to be nonpartisan, meaning it stays out of partisan politics. It needs to be politically astute. Some people say, well, we have to have an apolitical military. That's not true. The military has to understand politics. And by that, I mean the way that nations, that societies control and distribute power. It's things like government, it's things like budgeting, all those processes and institutions that go into making, like our country, the liberal democratic country, what it is. So the military needs to understand that. They also need to understand international politics. And so in some, they need to understand enough about what's going on politically in their own country and in the world in order to be able to plug into international frameworks of governance, policymaking, and action. And in doing that, we like to see a holistic military, one that really understands the military is only one instrument in the state's toolkit for foreign policy, and there are other instruments that are just as important, like diplomacy, like economic policy that Jon was talking about, and they all have their place and they should all work together. So in this nonpartisan ideal, we've got these politically astute, nonpartisan military leaders acting in the unequal dialogue with the civilian leadership in ways that underpin, that advance U.S. democracy and U.S. security. And oh, by the way, the military stays firmly under the control of the civilian leadership so that the military that would protect the nation won't turn on the nation. We've got a pretty good track record of that so far. So that is a source of stability in U.S. politics and society. And ultimately, that's the system that provides best advice, where the military leadership provide best advice to civilian leaders, and that best advice prioritizes national security over all other considerations. Then we have a not ideal situation where we see a military that's politicized. And by politicized, I mean the military's primary loyalty is to a single political party or a person. In our military, all military personnel take an oath of allegiance, an oath of loyalty to the Constitution of the United States. And so their loyalty should lie there. But in a politicized military, that loyalty to the Constitution becomes questioned. One of the signs of a politicized military, we see the military itself, the leaders, the institution consistently defending or advancing partisan agendas. The advice and actions of the military privilege partisan priorities over national security. And then finally, really a partisan identity, not this type of altruistic, non-partisan professionalism is what shapes service culture. So advancement becomes a function of your political connections or the things you do to please your political masters, not merit, which is what the system is pretty much based on now. So there's two politicizing trends we can see happening in the country today. One is what we call partisan activation by military members. So this is when military members, people in the military or veterans, basically go political. They identify with a party or a leader, and then they do all the things that we said, well, we don't like to see that. So partisan activities by active duty military personnel are still comparatively rare, although that's rising a little bit. And one of the reasons for that is that it's constrained by law and by regulation. If you could be punished if you act in ways that your expressions and actions are too political or don't follow those laws or regulations. So that's a pretty good incentive not to go too far down that path. However, when we talk about retired or former military, it's a different story. There really aren't any laws or regulations that prevent them from getting involved in politics. Matter of fact, often we see veterans running for office, which is considered perfectly okay within the military's professional norms. If you're going to go all in and run for office and put yourself on the line, that's considered fine. Where we get into problems is like what this slide illustrates, is we get these endorsements, usually by retired people, almost always, for political candidates. So they're endorsing candidates, they're endorsing platforms, and they're doing it in a way that where we see the politicians are trying to leverage the military's got a pretty good reputation, a lot of respect. So if these military leaders are following this politician, maybe that person is good. So it can have a public influence. We also have, whoops, I went backwards. This other side of the coin, where I have civilian politicians activating military support. So what's going on here is that we have the senior or civilian officials are courting or co-opting military personnel and institutions for their own purposes. And in doing this, as I mentioned before, often they're trying to leverage the high esteem that the public holds for the military. In some cases, we could say the candidates are let's say, ethically challenged or esteem challenged. So if you can bring people that have good reputations onto your side, what a great endorsement. So candidates seek military endorsements, and there's many retired senior military leaders, admirals and generals mostly, that are more than happy to provide that these days. And this is a change. This trend has been developing since the 1990s, and it seems like every election we see more and more endorsements from retired military. I think there's a little bit of a security dilemma happening here, where people who favor or people see one candidate being endorsed, and they don't really like that candidate, so they're endorsing the other one, not so much because they like the other candidate, but they just don't like the one that's being endorsed, right? So it's back and forth, and it kind of escalates that way. There also, we have some concerns about politicizing military promotions, where if there could be a policy that a particular party, a political party doesn't like, it may be defense related, it may not be, they can hold up defense promotions as a bargaining chip to try to, in the negotiation, that happens in the Senate. This is in the Senate, because the Senate approves of promotions and appointments nominated by the president. So we could see partisan agendas being mixed up with these promotions. We could also see, there's also some concerns about litmus tests. When you're appointing people to a high position in the armed forces, there's often hearings, they're approved individually by the Senate. If we start to impose political litmus tests on those individuals that they need to identify politically with the party in order to get their appointment, that could be problematic. So we're looking at their political credentials, not their professional national security credentials. So where does that lead us? Well, there's a number of consequences to military politicization that can occur, and we're starting to see some indication of that. The data is pretty thin right now, but I think we'll see, as time goes on, we'll see increasing studies to really understand exactly what's happening. But the first thing to go will be public trust. And the military, the danger here is the military will come to see the public will come to see the military as just another political institution. And in doing so, it's going to harm the faith that the country has in its military to act in the national interest. Andy talked about national interests. Those interests won't be what the military is trying to defend. They won't be trusted to do that. There's always going to be this gnawing doubt there's some kind of a political agenda behind what the military is doing. Military politicization brings risk to national security, and if it plays out far enough, the risk can be very grave. Specifically, damage military readiness and effectiveness. Polarization, military members could vote, they can have political opinions, but if they take over the ranks, then we're going to have a divided military. Are you red? Are you blue? What is this unit? What is that unit? Unit cohesion could break down. Morale could break down. In the end, we have a military that's not as able to fight when we need it to fight because they're too busy arguing with each other. The other thing is, and perhaps more significant, is compromised best advice, compromised military advice. if military leaders are giving advice to the civilian leaders based on partisan priorities and not national security, well, you can see the problems that could arise. And it becomes even more significant if the political orientation of the military leaders is not the same as the civilian leaders. You're going to see a breakdown in trust between those two sides of the equation, and you'll see that unequal dialogue I talked about pretty much break down. So now the military might be talking, the civilians aren't listening, they're not getting the best advice, and their decisions may not be the best decisions. Finally, there's the concern about risk to democratic norms. And in this situation, we're talking about a military that might be directed into American communities to enforce partisan political priorities. And in doing so, they may cause physical harm to the people who live in those communities. They may stifle public debate, and they may impede constitutional rights. Do we want a military that does that? That's a politicized, or it could be a politicized military. Finally, there's been some concern expressed about the military interfering with elections and the peaceful transfer of power. Now, we haven't seen that yet. There are countries where the military, I was in Chile or in Argentina, I lived there for 2 years, I was stationed there in the Navy, and every election they had the military standing out there by the polls. Do you want to see soldiers standing outside your polling places? You know, what signal does that send? So anyway, so at the end of the day, the politicized military really isn't in the nation's best interest, and we'll just have to see where these trends go. And that's it.
So we have to share this little microphone thing, but I think in the interest of time, maybe we'll take a few questions. You can see we're all kind of long-winded. But we'll take a few questions, and then we'll try to be really brief in our answers. How about that? Okay, so let me call on a couple of people, and anyone would like to raise their hand or make a comment or question. Yes.
Sure. To what extent is Russia's nuclear prowess a consideration in the various, meanderings back and forth of what to do or not to do related to Ukraine?
Okay, great question.
And it's okay if we go like 10 minutes or so over,
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's answer these two, and then that gives people time to relax. Go ahead, Scott.
So the answer to your question about sending troops into U.S. cities, the most recent round of this, the short answer is it's complicated. It's complicated. I can tell you that a lot of the troops going in there aren't too keen on the mission, but they're following orders, and it kind of puts the military in a bit of a dilemma, because on the one hand, the military is obligated to follow the lawful orders of the civilian leadership. On the other hand, all those things I talked about could happen even if there wasn't a political motivation on the part of the troops. And at this point, we really haven't seen that type of political motivation by the armed forces writ large. There may be individual soldiers that have their own political sentiments and they have an opportunity to act out, but they are constrained in their ability to do that by military regulation. And the question of legality is something that's working through the courts now. There's not a lot of precedent. So so far the legal pretense under which the Trump administration has been sending troops into cities, most lawyers or many lawyers will go, well, I'm not so sure about that. Or they might even say no, but at the end of the day, that's why we have courts. That's why it has to be adjudicated. Now, where it becomes interesting is if, say, there's a case with California. I think the appeals courts have said that it was not legal. It hasn't gone to the Supreme Court yet. And if the Supreme Court says that wasn't legal, and then we get some other cases down the line. I heard Portland is going to be next. Who knows? Memphis. If we get enough case law where it becomes it's pretty clear that this is illegal, and but the military continues to do it, then we've got a politicized military. So what we're seeing the military do right now isn't necessarily a reflection of a politicized military. It's a military that's under civilian control, and it's carrying out orders that at least have not been determined to be unlawful.
So the question was about nuclear escalation and what role that played, or the potential for nuclear escalation given Russia's capabilities. I think that it's fair to say from the initial invasion, full-scale invasion in 2022, the threat of nuclear escalation was at the forefront of the Biden administration. We could consider whether that was appropriate or not, but they definitely did not want to have a NATO-Russian war. They wanted to avoid a NATO-Russian confrontation because of the threat of escalation. But as things have progressed, there's different steps that have been taken. North Korea has sent troops. Russia is avoiding some of the sanctions by getting material from China. Russia has continually bombarded civilian targets. Now they have sent drones into European airspace. Now they've sent manned aircraft in. There's also the Nord Stream pipeline blowing up. There's other kinds of activities like bombs and things in shipping supply places in Europe. So there's a lot of evidence that Russia is actually doing some things in Europe, and also that every step of the way there was supposed to be a concern that if we were to send tanks, then Russia would use a nuclear weapon. If we were to allow for HIMARS, Russia would use a nuclear weapon. If we were to do this, basically everything that we've done in step along the way, there was a threat of escalation was voiced. But it seems clear now that Russia doesn't seem that interested in using nuclear weapons. They seem interested in taking over Ukraine and possibly moving into other parts of Europe. I mean, they have a lot of rhetoric about the Baltic states, about Poland, which you could say like, well, maybe they don't mean it. But you could say that in summer of 2021, that maybe Russia didn't mean it. So I think that the threat of escalation is real, but most people think that that threat has gone down, even though it's still there. But I think that's a matter of debate. I mean, we have debated this very question various times. I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
I would just say one thing. So there's a metaphor of the ladder of escalation, which is you're climbing up the ladder rung by rung, doing more and more aggressive things like sending HIMARS, sending this weapon system, sending the F-16s, Tomahawks. And all along, there was the fear that the Russians would escalate to the nuclear level, right? But the thing is that between the United States and Russia, everybody knows at the top of the level is nuclear war. So there's a real disincentive to go that far. So I've always thought that there's a pretty low likelihood that we're going to end up in nuclear war because everybody's going to be extremely conscious of that. The big turnabout or question would be, I think the risk was highest when the Russians were losing. In summer of 2023, it looked like there was an Ukrainian offensive, which might actually kick them out. And there was a danger. If the Russians were in danger of being simply thrown right out of Ukraine, they might be interested in escalating. That's going to be the big test. But so far, they're not really in danger of a catastrophic military defeat. So I think the danger is quite low at this point.
Yes.
I have a lot of questions about this latest proposal to end the war, but in order to limit my scope. So I'm probably jumping to some conclusions or assumptions about investment that would be necessary to rebuild Gaza. But it seems to me that the incentive to invest and the sources of those investments might really run counter to the interests of the people who live there. So I'm just curious about your thoughts of, was anything presented, I didn't see all the details, was anything presented about the future of the people who actually live there versus this vision for what it could be?
Well, as I mentioned, the concept that Gazans would leave or just emigrate to Egypt or someplace is gone from the current proposal. It's explicitly stated that they would stay, they would be encouraged to stay, they could leave, but they could come back. So that concept of sort of ethnic cleansing seems to be gone at this point. And there's a phrase there which says Gaza will be redeveloped for the benefit of the people of Gaza. So that's, that's a step in the right direction probably. The discussion of where the money comes from is a bit vague and has a sort of Trumpian feel about it. Talk about lots of exciting projects. Unclear who's going to fund it. It seems that the money is probably going to come from the Gulf states primarily. So is that going to be for the benefit of the people of Gaza? I mean, being out of this war will be to the benefit of the people of Gaza. And if Gaza were, assuming this could all happen, which I'm pretty skeptical of, but assuming it could all happen, it would be better by far than what has been so far. But I mean, the people who would own it, the people owning it, the people doing the investment are probably going to be the Gulf state people, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, what have you, and possibly some American or Western European investors, and they're going to be reaping a lot of the profits of it. But as a result of that, Gaza could get rebuilt. They could rebuild public infrastructure, roads, everything.
How likely is it that Hamas is going to give the hostages? It just doesn't seem likely to me.
It doesn't. So the question is, how likely is Hamas to give up the hostages? I have to admit, I'm skeptical that they will agree to this deal. It was framed as you have 72 hours starting from now to give up the hostages. Otherwise, it goes back to war. My suspicion is that Netanyahu is banking on the fact that they won't agree and that he'll be able to go back to business as usual in his campaign to eradicate Hamas. So I think very likely that this is not going to work. It's not going to happen. But if I were, Nostradamus, then I'd be making money in the stock market. So take it with a grain of salt.
I think Netanyahu's darkest nightmare is that Hamas says yes. Because a lot of things in this are things that his own coalition have objected to and will possibly walk. Right? The idea of a right of return, that Palestinians could leave and come back, it's been the single biggest sticking point to a two-state solution for 70 years. Palestinians can't come back. If you leave, you're gone. You can't come back. And this agreement gives them the right to do that. It forswears, it specifically says Israel cannot put troops in Gaza. Israel cannot occupy Gaza. Israel cannot occupy the West Bank. There must be some kind of doesn't say two-state solution. There must be something. Netanyahu's entire political career has been based on saying no to these things. And the idea that he knows Hamas is going to say no. Yeah. And if they said yes, it would be a shock to him. It would be a shock to Trump and an even bigger shock to Netanyahu, unfortunately.
Yes.
I had a question somewhat related to tariffs. So domestic policy and foreign policy tend to be presented as these two completely separate entities that don't overlap whatsoever. And I feel like tariffs have kind of shown that that's not exactly true, that there are certain avenues to some extent where they do overlap. And I'm curious if you think that maybe these tariffs are sort of shifting American perception on how foreign policy affects their lives, because I think in general Americans tend to not really pay attention to foreign policy as much as domestic policy. And if you do see that shift, how do you see it? And if you don't, do you think there should be a shift towards that, more integration of how we view domestic and foreign policy?
It's a great question, right? We have this phrase in the field where we say, on international relations, like during the Cold War, Democrats and Republicans, like Andy said, fought, but on some things, but in general, the deep division, politics stopped at the water's edge, right? And but then, during containment, it was all agreed upon. I agree with you in the sense of, I do think this is showing a lot of folks how much international relations and what goes on outside American borders really matters to them. That said, I don't think it's had the impact that it could have. I think ironically what will cause that shift will be the tariffs actually being implemented and the warehouses emptying out of the tariff-free goods and going to the grocery store and finding that bananas now cost $5 a pound, not 19 cents each, or that your Ford truck increases in price by 30%. Like that will drive home. We've all lived in a largely tariff-free world for most of our lives since 1948, basically. Industrial tariffs, tariffs on manufactured goods have been relatively low. Agriculture products are slightly different, but most of the ones that we buy in this country are relatively tariff-free. And that's starting to change. Right now, that's indistinguishable from inflation, the normal inflation that's happening. But if prices start to jump, and this is one reason Trump has backed off them, right, is to not let people come to this realization, right? Like, I don't know if you remember early on in the tariff days, Amazon said they were going to display the price of goods and how much a tariff was adding to that. And within hours, Trump had Bezos on the phone, right, and was like, don't you dare do this, right? And made all kinds of threats to him, to the Washington Post, everything else, right? And they backed down. But that's the whole point, is to keep that kind of out of people's consciousness. So for right now, I still think there's some of that distinction people make, but I think if the tariffs truly hit and you can trace inflation to tariffs, which I think could happen, then you'll start to see that break down a little bit. Yeah.
Any last questions?
Yeah, I had one that's kind of related to Israel. It seems like there's been sort of a attempt to strengthen relations between India and Israel, and I'm just curious about how you all see that impacting both in the short term and long term, the current war in Gaza, if those relations do end up getting strengthened.
Do you want to take a whack, or I'm?
I don't know much about it.
I was once in Israel, and I asked someone about the fact that Israel had gained a lot of support in this country from very conservative Christians who fundamentally believe that, right, who believe in Revelation, right, such that, right, the second coming will happen when all of the Jews return to Israel and they will all then die. And I said to Israelis, what do you think about that? Like, you're in bed with these folks, like politically, what do you think? And an Israeli minister told me, we'll take friends wherever we can find them, right? And I sort of feel like that with India, in the sense of, right, it's this sort of weird frenemies thing, right, where it's like, okay, India and the US are a bit at odds right now. India and Russia are okay right now. Russia and Israel are okay, I don't know what you'd say, like off and on, right? Frenemies, and so it's like this big frenemy mix, and India's in there. It's interesting today, and part of the Trump press conference was Iran, right? Oh, Iran's going to be part of the Abraham Accords next. Like, wait, what? Say what? And he's like, there's no reason why this can't happen. And so I put India and Israel in that same bucket. It's like, they kind of have this trade relationship that they want, right? India has some resources, especially on technological, pharmaceutical side, that Israel wants. Israel has investment that India wants in certain areas, and technology that India wants on the military side. Beyond that, I don't think there's much of a long-term implication of this, but yeah.
Well, I would just add,
One more. Go ahead.
well, I mean, Modi, the current president of India, is extremely anti-Muslim. His promotion of Hindu nationalism makes him anti-Muslim. But as John is saying, like, there's a lot of strange things. I mean, Iran has been a huge enemy not only of Israel, but also of Saudi Arabia. So you could see, okay, they kind of get together because they hate Iran. Iran is massively helping Russia in this war against Ukraine with the drones, et cetera. But then when Iran faced those strikes, Russia was just like, who, what, just nowhere to be seen. So Russia doesn't really support Iran. Russia did not support Assad in Syria. There's another blow to Iran. So there's a lot of mixed up aspects of things. But I think definitely part of the appeal may have been the Hindu nationalism and the anti-Muslim sentiment, in addition to other larger geopolitical factors.
That's what I was going to say.
All right, well, thank you for everybody for coming, and thank you for inviting us. I appreciate it.